Hi, good evening. Welcome to Author's Talk by Trishna. The Third Housemate, Story 6. Let's begin. Like most days, Wednesday too was very busy for Nidhi. But she was not her usual energetic self. She felt fatigue. Her body was aching. If this continued, she would soon fall ill. She managed to leave the office a little early and went straight to shop for the essentials. Loaded with stuff, she reached her apartment around 6:30. She had less than an hour to have tea, shower, and then drive to the airport. Manisha's flight was landing at 8. Nidhi switched on the kettle and went for a shower. As she stepped out in her bathing robe, she heard a soft sound of a metal rubbing against her surface. It was coming from the kitchen. Instead of going to the room, she walked into the kitchen. It was empty and very cold. Why is it so cold here? The kitchen is always the hottest place of the house. She rubbed her arms and exhaled deeply. Her breath instantly turned smoky like it did in the peak winters. Panic began to invade her senses. She quickly picked up her mug, dropped in a sugar cube, a tea bag, and turned to pour water in the mug. Then she watched aghast as the kettle moved on its own and fell down on the floor with a crash. The hot water splashed around as Nidhi jumped in reverse. The boiling water could have scalded my legs and my feet. There's something bizarre around, something that either wants us out or is trying to draw our attention. Someone now breathed into her ear, an icy breath. Hello. The voice was once again crisp, clear, and hollow. Nidhi was frozen for a moment. Her heart was pounding, her legs shivering, her eyes trying to locate the source of the sound. The kitchen was stark empty. She dashed out of the kitchen, quickly changed into her jeans and casual top with her wobbly hands, picked up her car keys, and rushed out of the house. Her legs were still shaky as she ran down the stairs. Money and I will have to seriously think of moving out of this house. It's no more a figment of my imagination. The bizarre in this house is real. I've never felt so unnerved. She drove slowly, having been caught in the slow moving heavy traffic of the evening. She contemplated. Before she could reach the airport, she received three snappy calls from Manisha, who was already out of the formalities and waiting outside for the past 15 minutes. Once in the car, Manisha excitedly informed Nidhi about her fruitful trip. Nidhi listened to her lively chatter with a smile. She loved it. How she had missed her throughout the week, all the more this time. Money. There was. Nidhi started but stopped midway. Should she tell her sister about uncanny experiences? She seemed so happy right now. Maybe later, after she had rested at home, she must be tired now. What was there, Didi? Oh, nothing. There was a terrible thunderstorm here yesterday, like the one when a glass had smacked on a door in the evening. Yes, and then went off to sleep. When I woke up, I found a great part of the room flooded. Room flooded? How? Probably the wind had thrown our door open while I was sleeping. You slept with the door unbolted when you were alone. Hello, we live in Delhi, not in Japan, Didi. How can you be so careless? It's not safe. I think I had bolted the door. You think of a lot of things, but you don't really do them. It is useless telling you things. Sorry, I opened my mouth. Don't try hiding your shortcomings, as if you are a Miss Perfection. The angry sisters remained silent for the rest of the way. Such tips were not at all unusual. The sisters mostly landed up arguing over trivial things, but that didn't weaken their bond. And sure enough, as they reached home, all was forgotten. Nice to be back home, Manisha announced as she alighted from the car. She took out the luggage from the boot, but she was allowed to carry only her travel bag, while Nidhi insisted on carrying her heavy suitcase, which she dragged all the way up to their house. Once inside, Manisha got busy unpacking. Nidhi went to the kitchen to prepare a quick meal. It's so hot and muggy in Delhi, Manisha grumbled as she switched on the cooler. Hey Didi, listen. She then hollered. The wind from outside can't open the door, it opens only one way from inside. Nidhi came in the bedroom. I know. She and Manisha both stood in front of the door, staring at it. Forget it. Manisha dismissed the affair after a while with the wave of her hand and moved away. Nidhi was still uneasy when they sat down to dinner in front of the TV. They watched the evening news, surfed a few channels, and Nidhi declared, I'm going to sleep, Money. Haven't slept well the last few nights. She expected Money to ask her the reason. Then perhaps she could discuss her experiences with her. But Manisha was busy watching a movie on the TV. Fine, you go to sleep. I will be going late to office tomorrow. I'll sleep in a while. And she went back to her movie. The moment she hit the pillow, Nidhi was fast asleep. So assuring was Manisha's presence. Manisha slept around 12. Sometime in the middle of the night, she woke up disturbed. A hand had lightly navigated from her shoulder down through her back until almost her ankles. What's wrong with Didi? It's not funny. What's she up to? She has never done that before. She pulled her sheet over her in utter annoyance. Didi, I'm fine. Please let me sleep. Her grumbling and shifting woke Nidhi up. She was sleeping quietly in her corner of their double bed with her back towards her. She now yawned and turned on her back, half awake and wondering why her sister had muttered in her sleep and called out her. It was then that she saw it. A dark shadow rose from the empty space between the two of them. It remained in the sitting position on the bed, just next to her. I'm hallucinating again. I've gone nuts. Unable to fathom what was going to happen, Nidhi stared at the shadow, immobile. She could hear her heart pounding against her ribs. She slowly turned her back towards the shadow. She shut and opened her eyes to check if she was really awake. Who was this bizarre thing sitting on their bed? She began to tremble. And then Manisha's irritated words reached her ears. Didi, stop fiddling with my cooler. Just leave it alone. Nidhi turned her head to look at her. Then her gaze went to the cooler. The shadow was now in front of it, the same shape and size as she had seen on the terrace a few days ago. Shadow of a slim man of an average height. Money, I'm here on the bed, she whispered timorously. Her mouth had gone dry. She had realized what she could see was also visible to Manisha. She was not hallucinating. The shadow in the room was real. Manisha turned to look at her sister and then at the shadow in front of the cooler. It hadn't moved. Who was this third person in their room? She jumped out of the bed and reached for the table lamp. The moment the room got flooded with light, the shadow of a man dissolved. There was no one visible anymore. They both remained sitting on their bed for a long time, frozen and disturbed. They were modern, rational girls who had never believed in the paranormal, but now, without a shadow of a doubt, they had a ghost living with them. Both of them were too drained to go to office the next morning. As they sat down for the morning tea, the matter naturally cropped up. Oh my God, I still don't believe it, Didi. We live with a ghost. Manisha covered her face with her palms and squirmed. Money, please, not so loud. Nidhi looked around to see if the ghost would react. Where do you think he is now? She whispered. Nidhi looked around. Terror in her eyes was obvious. Come on, Didi. The ghost is not evil. He even caressed me. Manisha had a lopsided grin on her face. Nidhi spoke in a muted voice. Living with a ghost is not safe, Money, neither amusing. It's scary. You never know where it will lead us. Whose ghost is it? We need to do something about it. We'll have to change the house. After breakfast, they decided to discuss the matter with Mrs. Usha Mittal, their landlady. Mrs. Mittal, well into her late 60s, lived alone on the ground floor of a three-storied house. She had lost her husband a few years ago, and her two children were married and settled in the US. It had been a surprise for her that the young girls hadn't come to her with any complaints. The previous two tenants had stayed for only about a 6 week each. The second one had, in fact, stayed for exact 6 days. The young man had packed his bags on the seventh day and had rushed out. He hadn't even bid a proper farewell, for he was angry that the landladies hadn't informed him about the apartment being haunted. So, when she received a call from the girls saying that they would like to see her, she decided to visit the apartment. So, young ladies, how have you been? Asked Mrs. Mittal, lowering herself into the easy chair. I expected a visit from you which never came about. When you called, I was thinking about you girls only. We are absolutely fine, Mrs. Mittal. Fine as fine can be. Manisha sat on the other free chair. We are doing well, but had been really busy. Sorry we didn't get time to visit you, added Nidhi. Mrs. Mittal's eyes scanned the room. Everything appeared calm and composed, though the girls appeared perturbed and a bit pale perhaps. Hope things aren't as nasty as with the previous tenants. There were a few questions on her mind that she was hesitating to ask. A cup of tea, Mrs. Mittal? Nidhi asked. Sure. Nidhi left to prepare tea. Mrs. Mittal looked at Manisha and bringing her face closer, she asked softly, Manisha, are you sure everything is fine here? Why do you ask? Manisha smiled. She realized now that Mrs. Mittal was well aware of the presence of a ghost here. No wonder the rent of this apartment located in this posh colony was so low. No, no, just like that. I wanted to see you young ladies well settled here. That's my duty, you know. Manisha nodded, but she didn't want to further the discussion till Nidhi was present too. They both sat quietly for a while. Mrs. Mittal looked out of the window, rovered her eyes around as if she was searching for something. There was anxiety on her face. Finally, Manisha broke the painful silence. Things are fine, except there are strange happenings sometimes. She looked straight into Mrs. Mittal's eyes to see her reaction and noted that her eyes had instantly dilated in the apprehension. "What happenings?" Mrs. Mittal asked the dwindling spirits. Just then Nidhi walked in with 3 steaming cups of tea. After offering tea to her guest and then to Manisha, she picked up her cup and settled cross-legged on the divan. There were only 2 chairs in the room. Nidhi had overheard the conversation. She now stated casually, "You know, Mrs. Mittal, a few days ago an unknown being was seated on the same chair as you are seated on right now." "What?" Mrs. Mittal jumped up in fright, spilling tea on her sari. Manisha rushed to fetch her a napkin. "What scared you so, Mrs. Mittal? I didn't say that the strange being was a ghost." Manisha suppressed her smile. "Do you think of the possibility of such an existence?" Mrs. Mittal slowly sat back on the chair. There was no doubt that she had gone pale, but she didn't rush out at the mention of the ghost, as the girls had expected. The 3 women mutely sipped tea for a while. Mrs. Mittal was the one to break the silence. "I'm sorry, girls. I should have told you." "Told us what?" "Told you that people have experienced strange activities here. 2 of my previous tenants left within a week of staying in the rooms. We know the reason." Nidhi smiled benignly at the elderly lady. "What do you know?" Mrs. Mittal asked. "We have seen the ghost of a young man, lean, medium height." She spoke casually, as if she was describing a friend. "Weren't you frightened? How come you didn't run away like the young men, my previous tenants?" "The ghost means us no harm anymore. He even shares our bed. We realized this last night." Manisha chuckled. "Oh my God!" The ghost was rather violent with the young man who had hired the apartment. He would hurl things at them. Not only that, the second tenant said he kept pulling at his sheet at night and wouldn't let him sleep a wink. It was as if he wanted him out of the house. We are not saying there wasn't an attack. There were a few real deadly ones too. 2 days after we had shifted to this house, it flung a glass pane to us. We think it was him. Pretty scary and dangerous. Manisha could have been seriously hurt, but that time we were confused, never realized it was on purpose. Nidhi shook her head and shuddered, recalling the incident. "And then perhaps it intentionally threw down a kettle with young boiling water that could have scalded my feet. But by and by he seems to have calmed down, as became rather peaceful. He must have developed liking for you, young girls. And imagine sleeping in your bed." Mrs. Mittal smiled gently. "Do you know whose ghost it is?" Nidhi asked. Mrs. Mittal sighed and nodded. Both the sisters stiffened and exchanged glances. Mrs. Mittal swallowed the last sip of her tea. Keeping her empty cup on the table, she placed her hands limply on her lap. She had a faraway look in her eyes. "Beta, last year I had placed an advertisement in the paper for renting out this apartment. The same evening a young man came to see me. Like you said, slim, medium height, and good looking. He was very keen to stay in this apartment. He was about to get married and wanted to bring his bride to this quiet, peaceful colony after his wedding. He said he had fallen in love with my house." Mrs. Mittal closed her eyes and shook her head dejectedly. After a short pause, she continued, "We haggled over the rent for a solid half an hour. He then told me that he couldn't afford what I was quoting, but requested me allow him less rent for few initial months. He will surely manage to give me the quoted rent after his appraisal in a few months. I was taken in by the sincerity in his words and finally agreed on his quote. Exactly what do you now give? In fact, I have not increased the rent ever since. Mrs. Mitchell shook her head sadly. She looked out towards the terrace and sighed deeply. Ever since what? Manisha asked softly. Ever since the tragedy. He had barely been in the house for a week, the week he had spent shopping and decorating the house for his bride, when the calamity struck, exactly a week before he was to be married. His bride to be met with a fatal accident. Mrs. Mitchell sighed again and closed her eyes as if the tragedy was hovering before her eyes. How? Nidhi whispered. I think she was on her way to her work when her two-wheeler was hit by a bus. Then what happened? Manisha asked anxiously. That evening, when the young man returned home around 5, I was walking out to attend my party. We met at gate. I noticed his disheveled clothes. His face was pale, crestfallen, his red eyes swollen. So I stopped to check if he was feeling well. He told me about the tragedy. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. I expressed a quick sympathy and hurriedly walked out, considering my party more important. Although I knew he wanted me to be with him, the way he had looked at me pleadingly, I left him alone to cope with his terrible misfortune. She sighed in exasperation. That was a big mistake to have walked out. It was very insensitive of me. I should have stayed with him. Poor man had lost his parents in accident a few years ago, and here was another terrible tragedy shattering his life. He needed company and sympathetic ears. Oh, that's so sad, Nidhi said. Yes, it was sad, but things got much worse. When I returned home 2 hours later, there was a big crowd gathered outside. A few police vans were parked at the gate, and the policemen were scurrying around the urgency. I froze, scared and apprehensive. My heart quivered and my legs trembled. What's wrong? I asked the policeman. A young man living on top floor has committed suicide by jumping down from the terrace of his house, he said. I gasped. Then I saw his body wrapped in a white sheet lying on a stretcher. The sheet had fresh blotches of blood all over. I felt suffocated and then I fainted. Never thought this could happen in my house. Mrs. Mitchell lowered her head, almost on the verge of crying. That's so tragic, Manisha whispered woefully. I'm so sorry, Ramit, so sorry. Please forgive me. Tears were freely rolling down the lady's cheeks. I could have saved your life had I known. Was Ramit his name? Mrs. Mitchell nodded slowly. There was a painful hush in the room now. Usha Mitchell's sniffles slowly died down. She wiped her face. I'm sorry, girls. I have not cried like this for a long time. But since I lost my husband, may the soul rest in peace. May Ramit's soul rest in peace too. Nidhi stated, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Manisha sighed and nodded. The three women instinctively joined their hands to pray. The silence got broken by the tinkling clock, a reminder of the transience of human life and the blessings of being alive. The three occupants of the room remained unaware of the brevity of time as they sent heartfelt and silent prayers for peace and perseverance of people struck by terrible misfortunes. They ardently prayed for eternal peace of Ramit's troubled soul. Nidhi and Manisha lived in that house for 4 years and never again felt any strange presence there. The spirit had finally found peace, for someone had prayed sincerely for the unsettled soul. That was all it was seeking. So that's all for today. Hope you like this story. We'll meet next time with new story. Till then, subscribe to my channel, like, share and comment. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.